Hello, everybody. Welcome to GM Joel's Chess Week Recap on ICC. This week, we'll feature games from the Cutthroat competition at the Aeroflot tournament in Moscow, and we'll also take a look at a more convivial competition on the Emerald Isle. Now, open tournaments will always produce an upstart along the way. Ishika Revati is not an up-and-comer at age 30, but the start for the Indian WGM/IM was quite remarkable. With 2 wins and 2 draws against 2,600 level players, she found herself among the early leaders. Here's how she scored the point in the 4th round against a grandmaster from Kazakhstan. So it starts off as one of these B3 sidelines against the Sicilian, but after knight c6, it's really kind of a transposition into a Rossolimo. So e5, it's a lot about pawn structure here. Black wants to play e5 and sort of solidify his bubble of pawns in the center, but e5, white is getting ready to break it up. And if black pushes d5, as I think most amateur players would do, then white targets the c5 pawn, tries to attack it with knight and bishop and whatever. So here black decides better to take, even though they're now doubled isolated pawns. But black gets a little momentum from this attack, queen d5, knight f3, otherwise something drops, queen check, and now queen e2 drops the c2 pawn, so white accepts the loss of castling. So we get to a position where black has a very, very weak pawn on c5, but white is not developed properly, and black also has the bishop pair. So basically, black always has some compensation for those weaknesses. And there was a bit of repetition business here. Queen e3, queen g4. White is okay, saying you're much higher rated. It's your job to avoid a draw. And then eventually black says, okay, here we go. f5, f4, I guess to control that g5 square, and also the rook may have to come out that way. So it's very complicated. There were certainly a lot of moves that could have been played along the way here, but it's a very tense game, with black having compensation. And various moves black could have played. Nothing special here. Bishop c8, black still maintaining compensation. Knight e3 maybe wasn't that good a move because now the knight on c5 is truly pinned, as the bishop on a3 would hang. King h8. We're coming up to a critical moment in the game. Black tries to bring the queen in, and then knight d3, so that uncovers the bishops on each other while attacking the queen. And here, black really missed the last good moment for knight e2. There were several times that he could have played knight e2 in the game, but this one he really needed to do. White really has to take it because king f1, black will take this knight on d3, and if you take the rook, then bishop takes a3. So black is coming out ahead there. So white has to sacrifice in exchange here, and he can take the queen. This is kind of interesting variation. Black gets the queen right back, queen f1. All right, so we trade that. Black takes here, and white gets back a little material with knight g6. So at the end of this line, white has 3 pawns for a piece, but it's a knight against the bishop pair, so it's good for black. In any case, Jumbayev, Rina Jumbayev, really needed to go for that, because after queen takes e4, bishop e7, now white consolidates the position. And this check doesn't cause any damage because white can safely go to the h-file And now white starts to consolidate the position and take over, and black finds himself losing material. First, he makes his sacrifice, knight takes g3, which I think white can even take it, but much stronger still is knight takes f3. And here white just wins a piece cleanly. She could take the rook on f8, desperado, but this is very simple as well. Queen h5, now knight h4, the bishop on f5 is pinned. And simple continuation, white goes in, trades queens, and just emerges with an extra piece. So Ishika Revati in that game kind of hanging on for dear life, and Jumabayev looking for the attack and never materialized, and white just won material and consolidated. So Revati off to this big start. She cooled off, lost a couple of games, but after round 6, I think they just are playing round 7 today. After 6 rounds, she was still on a Grandmaster norm pace, so that would be certainly a tremendous result for her if she could keep it up. All right, we're going to check out another game from round 4 with a tactical flourish that came out of a very placid-looking position, and it concluded with a wrongly executed combination, which unsurprisingly produced the wrong result. We're going to take a look at this game next. All right, we have a game between Kirill Alexeenko and Daniil Youfho. Both of them have a double I in their first name, by the way. It's kind of curious. And so far, it's not been a very exciting game, but it looks like black is kind of getting something here, outplaying white positionally. But now comes bolt from the blue, bishop takes g7. And it seems that this move is unsound. King takes, queen g4. And now I'm really not entirely sure why black didn't play king f8. For sure, rook f7 is not there because king takes, rook f1, king e7. Black is able to run, has the d6 square. So definitely not that second sacrifice. White could play something like queen f4 and take on h6. But I don't think there's a mate there. Although it looks kind of scary, but the computers don't see anything there. So Youfho played king h8, rook f7, rook g8, queen h4. All right, so white is threatening mate. And here, Youfho had this idea to sacrifice the rook on g2, but it was insufficient in the position that he played it in. He does, however, have a draw. And possibly he thought he was going to have more than that with king h8, because he can play e5, and now the rook defends h6. White would go queen e7. So this is basically an unstoppable mate unless black comes up with a combination. But he does have one. He can play rook takes g2, king takes, and not queen takes b2 in this case, because then the queen turns out to be too far away. All right. So the way to do it would be after e5, queen e7, rook g2, king takes g2, queen c2 check, king up. You have to avoid if you go back to g1, you get a nasty check with the rook, and then you're looking at getting mated, king h1 also. So actually white has to be a little careful, but white stays out of the way of the rook, so the rook doesn't get a check. And basically, black gives perpetual check. That's a draw. No risk there for black in that rook sacrifice. But he did it the wrong way. He sacrificed the rook too early. And now queen c2 would not do the job because the king can tuck in the corner because pawn on e4 is defended. So Youfho tried queen b2, and then after rook f2, Perhaps he forgot the rook could simply retreat, still maintaining mate threats. 93 king h3, black had to resign. So it was a game which was really kind of boring. Trust me, he didn't miss anything in the first few moves. Suddenly the explosion of sacrifices, and the game ends with some tactical opportunities missed. So that was Alexeenko against Youfho. Both of those guys are 20-year-old Russian grandmasters. Alexeenko took first at the Rilton Cup, which takes place at the end of last year, beginning of this year. So, two of a whole lot of strong, youthful Russian players. Okay. Vladislav Artemyev looked strong through 5 rounds. The 5th round, he took down the veteran Moldovan grandmaster Viktor Bologan. When Bologan played very ambitiously in the opening with black, couldn't back it up, found himself in deep trouble, and Artemyev was able to get the win. So let's take a look at that game next. Okay, so Artemyev c4. In very early e3, okay, he's not allowing bishop b4 for now. Usually white plays e3 with the knights out, but in this case, Bologan, because his knight is not on c6, decides to try to take advantage with c6. Kind of like playing a c3 Sicilian down a tempo. I'm not sure that it's really recommended. And then he, could play knight d7 cautiously, but he goes for a kind of reversed French, really down 2 tempi, down 1 tempi because he's black, and down a second one because he moved the pawn twice. So it seems like a little bit on the dubious side. And so he's working hard to protect the pawn, and then g4, which is a very typical thematic spike in the French, usually with colors reversed. So white is trying to break down the center. So Bologan holds that up for a bit with h6, but now rook g1. Now it's real g5 is coming. So he plays g5, and now it gets very strange because you'd think that black would take back on d5, and maybe white plays rook h1 to take the h file, and we could get some interesting stuff here. Let's say, for instance, black castles. I mean, he can move the rook instead as well. But there's a very interesting idea for white here to go rook into h6, and then whatever move black plays almost, white can sack in exchange here to take on d5 and break down the pawn structure in the center, and it looks pretty good for white. But still, it seems like a very puzzling decision to take on h4 here, which allows white to really dominate the center and have better development as well. So the opening really looks like a disaster for black. He gets a pass pawn in the 7th rank, but it doesn't look like that pawn is gonna stay for long after white plays f4. So black is really behind in development, and you would think that he would have lost a lot quicker, but somehow Bologan was able to stay in the game for a long time. I suppose that Artemyev probably missed some opportunities for quicker knockout, and clearly he has a tremendous position. One wonders a little bit what Bologan was going for strategically here. So white maintains the advantage for a long time. I wouldn't say that he's playing the most accurate moves, but he has that mass of pawns in the center, which is very strong. But black keeps hanging in there, and he gets to castle on move 31, which is pretty cool. And black was actually kind of creeping closer into the game. With b4, probably that was not recommended. And so he invites the queen in, but now he's about to get counterattacked, so he had to force a trade of queens. And white just puts the d pawn through, takes, and now he cuts off the bishop at the end. And that means the pawn will queen or cost black his rook. So strange game. I don't really understand what Bologan was doing in the opening. It certainly didn't work out, and then he managed to stay in the game for a long time, but eventually he went down. Now Artemyev, he was looking good, but he met his match in round 6. Dmitry Kovalev took him out, took over first place at that point with 5 out of 6. Now Vladimir Fetisov, who has shown both great playing strength and great stubbornness in tournaments recently, is having a rough time at Aeroflot after suffering a brutal loss to Iranian international master Amin Tabatabaei. Don't ask me if I'm pronouncing that in any way correctly. There's an awful lot of vowels at the end of that name. But we're going to see that surprising upset coming up next. Okay, so Fetisov playing white, and it's advanced Caro-Kann, h4. And I think that lately a lot of players are now hazarding this line with h6. H5 is probably a little bit more popular traditionally. H6, G4, of course. There was the famous game where black retreated the bishop to d7 and white played h5. Kramnik against Leko, and Kramnik needed to win that last game to save his world championship title. But lately, a lot of people have been going for this line, which basically challenges white to play e6. Otherwise, white didn't really get anything from pushing all those pawns. And then black doesn't want to take it because then his bishop gets stuck, but he's able to force white to take. And it's not entirely clear what white gains from all this. He has his majority of pawns on the king side to use as an attack, but he doesn't have a lot of development, so it's really a position that's kind of up in the air. Now, Fetisov plays bishop d3, right, which is a fairly common move. But now, in most of the games, there aren't a huge number of games, but white usually develops his pieces, and that would have been something to recommend to Fetisov in this game. For instance, there's been a few games like this. So white develops the pieces, looks maybe to castle queen side, and then try to get at the king on f7, which is a little bit exposed. That kind of makes sense to me. Fetisov just went basically hog wild in this game. He plays h5. I don't know that move is really necessary just yet. And e5, and now f4. So you look at the beginning of the game, and all but bishop d3 and the recapture on d3, everything has been a pawn move. And it just looks very dubious to me. Queen f5. And I guess the hope was that he would be forcing the king onto the e-file, and then the black's development would be disorganized. He wouldn't be able to get the rook into play. But, perhaps he just miscalculated on this. I have a feeling that this was maybe an over-the-board inspiration. Otherwise, it's really terrible opening preparation, pregame preparation. Because after g5 takes queen g3, it becomes apparent white is not winning a piece in this variation. And black always has queen g4. And after rook e8 threatening mate, knight f3, he has queen g4 in this position, Tabatabaei. And probably that's even the best move. And, black just has a position, doesn't have to sacrifice any material. He's just got a lot better development. But black instead goes for this very creative rook e2. And he's got to take that. Queen g2, king d3. Now, you might expect black to take this rook, and then you can see gf, queen f1, king d4, and this is another variation that is likely to lead to an unusual type of perpetual check. In various ways, d4 check is a playable move for black, but the according to the computer, it eventually leads to perpetual check. But I like black continuation better. He just creeps queen f2, and that threatens a mate in one with knight c5. So white has to defend that mate. He takes, so he gets a square. Now, thankfully for him, the knight f6 is pinned. Check, king d3. So it looks like perpetual check. And frankly, this seems to be a problem Fetisov has. He had the game in the Russian championship where he just went crazy in an endgame against Svidler, and with even pawns trying to win, and that basically threw the Russian championship in Svidler's direction and away from Fetisov. And here again, I think he makes a very poor decision. There's still a number of rounds left to go in the tournament. He has to admit that he wasn't this. What he tried here wasn't a success. But he plays king b3, and it doesn't necessarily lose. But I think it really just makes it harder for white to play. Knight c5 is leading to mate, so he's got to stop to defend that c3. Queen d3. And now queen f1. This was a mistake. He needed to play g6 check. Now king g8, queen e6 would be a rather sudden end, right? So he's got to go to the e file. If he goes king e8, queen c8 is actually strong, and then rook e1 pins the knight, and black is not able to get the mate threats organized because his king is stuck in the way. So instead of king e8, much better to play king e7, as awkward as that is. Now after rook e1, black can play king d8 and get everything organized again. But the thing is that after king e7, now would be a much better moment for queen f1, and this in this case could be a playable move for white. But by not throwing in that check, queen f1 right away, this leads to problems. Check, king a3, rook h5. Okay, this shot really isn't that hard to see. As I was playing over this on the internet, that move caught my eye. Taking advantage of the fact that if white trades the queens at this moment, knight takes comes with check, and then the rook hangs. White, of course, can't take the rook, and if he allows black to take on h1, that distracts the queen away, and then the black is in position to mate. So black activates that rook with an important tempo, and now threatens a mate on a4 as well as others, b4. And now white would be okay with most moves, but a5 is winning. It's kind of an obvious move to break open the pawn cover. And white takes a knight because he doesn't really have a whole lot of useful defensive moves anyway. And now it's basically a forced mate. And from here on, black has a number of good moves at any turn. I think queen a4 was pretty strong here. Rook f5 was actually a little inaccurate because after queen h3, white can make it a little bit more difficult. But after queen g2, now it starts getting into mating territory. And as the white king comes towards his pieces on the king side, that's when he actually goes down after knight e4. And okay, the king goes to the e file. Nasty discovered check. You can start by taking the knight on d2. King f1, queen d1 is mate. King f3, queen d3. So that's all she wrote after knight e4. So for me, very strange game. I think Fetisov just playing very stubbornly. Another game, I don't know what somebody was thinking in the opening. It just seemed to be very rash there. And maybe he's just got to really tone it down a lot. He obviously is tremendously talented and strong, but that was a very foolish game. And so this young 17-year-old international master from Iran was the beneficiary, is a huge rating at 2577, but is officially an IM. I don't know if he's got all his norms or what, but is poised to make a name for himself. Now, it should be noted, however, that he lost in the first round to, of all people, Ishika Revati. That was how she got everything rolling. All right, well, I'll let you know how the tournament concludes in next week's show. Meanwhile, let's shift gears to a tournament with a small prize fund that nevertheless attracts a lot of grandmasters year to year. The Bunratty Festival crams a lot of games into one weekend. But the games are not FIDE rated, and that's a little bit of an incentive for a lot of guys to come there because they're not really risking anything. And it is one of the most social tournaments in the world. I can say from experience, I've been there more than once, and I highly recommend going down there, having a few pints and playing a few chess games, although not necessarily at the same time. Nigel Short, Sergei Tivyakov, and Gawain Jones are among the GMs on hand. I believe that Tivyakov ended up coming in first place. But I looked over the games from the first few rounds, and Gawain Jones survived a barn burner in round 3 against a man who is quite noted for his organization of tournaments, but less for his playing of chess. That's Malcolm Payne. Malcolm tried to inflict some of his name with some creative and aggressive play, but couldn't quite finish the job. So we'll look at that one next. All right, so Malcolm Payne is international master in a previous life, and a good chess player. People lose sight of that because he's busy just organizing now, and this is an opportunity for him to go to tournament and have some fun. And he really got his money's worth in this game. King's Indian. Queen b4, knight d1. Okay, so that defends c4 by uncovering the queens. And black has taken the queen in some games. Queen a4 has been played. But here, white offers a repetition. And so if black wants to keep this going, he's going to do something else, try something else. So he plays a5. And so if white takes the queen, opens a file, certainly will be happy with that. So Malcolm played rook c1 to defend give the pawn some protection. And the typical h5 comes forward. And now one might expect white to play bishop e2, not only developing, but creating a square on f1 and also defending the f3 pawn. So if black plays h3, white can move the g pawn without f3 hanging. That would be sort of a normal continuation. But Malcolm plays rook c3. So he interrupts the communication between the queens. And after h4, well, now what, right? Because knight e2, c4 is hanging, not to mention h3. But he gets a little Aronian on him, inspired by that Aronian MVL game where Levon sacrificed a piece in this manner successfully. But the difference is that the knight on g3 and at this moment isn't really in position to move away because the bishop is still sitting on f1. So here, black could have declined the sacrifice. Perhaps move the rook, or play something like bishop d7, or maybe rook e8. And that would give the extra flight square for the king, and black would have a good position. But it looks like Malcolm's a little crazy here. So Gawain takes the piece, and knight e8, and this does kill the mate, but it's not that simple. Now a3 probably should go queen back to b6, because this actually ties white down a little bit because you're hitting the b2 pawn, so white can get the queen in, but then the knight on d1 isn't able to move so easily because the pawn on b2 is hanging. So queen a4, and already white actually has enough compensation for the piece. There's no immediate mate, but for instance, white can play knight f2. Already computers think that white has enough compensation, and it's really not easy for black to consolidate. Malcolm played f4, which the computers don't like so much, but still it's not so easy for black to consolidate this position. Maybe Jones should have tried queen e8 to get that queen back into play. After the move f takes e4, white has a very interesting little Zwischenzug here. He can play rook h7, and after rook f7, only now bishop e2. And at first it looks kind of strange, but the idea is that if bishop f5, now you have rook g7, and you take the other minor piece, and white is doing very well, now only down in exchange, but has tremendous compensation, lots of juicy squares to play with on the king side. But even so, after bishop e2, here queen e8 could have been tried again. Bishop f5, this tempo doesn't really work out that well for black because white starts getting the pawns forward. And before long, these pawns are strangling black, and actually white builds up a decisive advantage. f5, and he has a number of strong moves, many points, queen f7. Black is really just hanging on for dear life here. Queen f8, and now, probably this is also their last move. White could just simply retreat the queen, and g5 is coming. Black just can't do anything about it. There's no way to get his pieces organized, and white will just take the piece back, and then he has all these pieces pointing at the black king. So Malcolm plays g5. I think he was playing to the crowd a little bit, because he's not a professional player. I think he was looking to maybe to finish the game with a flourish. g5 is more complicated. It's winning, but it's more complicated. So what black has to do this, and now white could go back to simple chess by just simply taking on f6. There's no chance to take the rook for sure because queen g6 and rook h3 mates. So basically, black could trade queens, but it's a totally lost position. Queen h8 is objectively an okay move, but it gives white chances to make mistakes. Bishop h5. Now Jones sees that knight takes is not a solution because after queen takes, g4 is coming. King moves g4, and the bishop has no place to go. If bishop g6, queen h6 check, followed by rook f1 and picking up the queen. So white takes back the sacrifice piece and then just crushes with queen and two rooks, basically against an undefended king. So Jones tries, I think correctly, tries bishop g6. And now simple chess here for white, just retreat the queen, and black cannot save the knight. Gets mate if he tries to move it. So white is just going to take the knight and then just get the king. Again, three heavy pieces, no defenses, and no risk because he gets the knight right away. But Malcolm thought he had a big flourish. He played rook h6, and unfortunately he missed that black does not have to take the rook. Well, I'm going to assume that that's what he missed. If black takes the rook, this will be mate, and it will be kind of a pretty one. Rook h4. King, where can the king go? If the king goes here, then we could see, I believe, queen h5 check. This looks like a mate. And rook h4. So let's say the king keeps going forward. Check. King goes back, and now we can see the queen getting into a check. And if king e5 doesn't really help, because if the queen g3, queen f4, rook h5, the queen drops. So let's say king f5, rook h1 is pretty good. King g6, let's say queen h7, king f6, and now white can win the queen. And that's a winning position, but even stronger is rook f4, not allowing the black king to go in the center because of capturing e4. And white will win the queen for the rook and lots of pawns, and totally winning position. Okay, it's all really kind of unnecessary for white to go into these complications. But the problem is after king f4, the black king simply runs away. And the problem for white is that now he got his queen stuck in there. If his queen could just escape to any random square, he would probably give checkmate. But the queen is stuck in there, and he can't get it really unstuck. And the problem here is that in this variation, the diagonal is not open, this long diagonal, so black simply runs away with the king. And after a few more moves, Malcolm had to admit defeat. Very unfortunate. Really beautiful game, you know, very spirited game with, and that's the kind of spirit that people play with in Bunratty. They're having a good time in these games, but poor Malcolm couldn't finish it off, and Gawain Jones got the point. So, all right, there you have it. That does it for this week. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope you will join me next time on GM Joel's Chess Week Recap on ICC.